Hi everybody, welcome to your weekly video meditation for the week leading up to August 30th. We are going to have a theme this week that I am going to call flourishing. It comes from a word in Greek, eudaimonia, which actually literally means good-spirited, but in this sense, I like to use the word flourishing because it's more descriptive of what I mean. That the human being is created by God to grow and over time. And on this level of the playing field, I like to say, before we pass away and go on to the next level of creation, sometimes called heaven, on this level of creation, we're not done. We're never done, I think, growing or flourishing. So we're going to focus on flourishing on Sunday. Now, I want to say that in this culture, the idea of flourishing is hard, and I mean for the culture writ large, everyone, not just Christians, especially people that don't follow a religious path, specifically aren't Christian, because of something that's called, this is a fancy term, but I'll explain it, of course. It's called the postmodern age. We're in the postmodern age. And what characterizes the postmodern age is what philosophers call the dissolution of grand narratives, that these big overarching systems of thought and ways of thinking have, holes have been poked in them. American exceptionalism, American history, and us being always the good guys and always right. That's one mythical narrative that is dissolving in as much as the weaknesses are showing very clearly. Christianity as a grand narrative, specifically the Protestant Christian work ethic, it's the holes are being poked in that. And I don't mean that Protestant Christianity is wrong. Obviously, I wouldn't be in this particular vocation if I thought that. But that the weaknesses of it or the bad actors of it are, because of historical criticism, are becoming clear. And so it's being asked to change and to own up to its bad actions, its hypocritical actions that go against what Jesus intended in the past. So these grand narratives, capitalism, all these things are being called into question. And so people are having a hard time, especially in the West, finding a moral compass. What is good, and what do I do with my life? The perennial human question, what should I do? How should I live my life? So without that, flourishing is hard. This idea of growth, blooming is hard. And I don't mean pleasure when I say goodness or growing, or it's not always feeling good. The idea that the highest moral good is pleasure is called hedonism. And that doesn't mean just pleasure as we may think of it. The resorts that are called hedonism, it's not just sexual pleasure. It's not just entertainment that we see on the TV or Netflix, whatever. Pleasure is also good music, good food, some of the pursuits that we think are even morally good, the opera or the ballet. But we get this sense that to feel badly, have a bad day, have arguments and a rough life, that there's something somehow wrong, that we've got to scramble and find a pill, we got to find a way of being that counteracts this this discomfort, because it's wrong to feel uncomfortable. It's wrong to suffer moments of struggle. Now, we certainly don't want that, but it is part of life, and it specifically is part of life when we want to grow into the best people we can be. I think of going to the gym. It's not that fun. In the beginning, at least, I understand from exercisers that it gets to where you really want to go, and I'm really hoping to get to that place one time. So that's all to say that flourishing involves also dealing with the reality of suffering and hardness in our lives. So back to this Sunday, we see in one of the scripture readings that I'm not going to use this time, From Exodus, we see Moses and his experience with God, I'll say face to face. I don't want to anthropomorphize too much, meaning you make God a human figure. But we use face because we're humans. It helps us to understand what we're doing. So he comes in direct contact with God, and God talks about what God's name is, and that's got some very interesting theological implications. But I don't want to go there right now. We can do that. I'll do that some other day. But so Moses is seen when he goes up on the mountain and he has this contact. He's a wonderful historical figure, definitely the history of our faith, and leads to the Ten Commandments. We must remember anytime that we talk about Moses that he didn't want to go. He didn't want to go back to Egypt. He got out. He had that altercation where someone died. He technically murdered someone. And he goes out into the desert and he finds a wife and he finds a family, and he's going to live in peace and pleasure and comfort. And he doesn't want to go back. God's the burning bush moment. Go free my people, go free my people, go free my people. And he goes, and that is the movement towards flourishing. That it's not going to be easy, but that is what he's called to do. That's his vocation. That's his calling. So we can do that very often, that we're called to do in the places that we fit and the places that we go, to bring the gospel message of love and forgiveness, grace and mercy. And it's hard. We don't want to do that. But there is a place for us that only we can fit. And it's not going to be comfortable. It's not going to be easy. But it is the way to flourish. And that is something that people that follow the way of Christ have, that I like to invite, as a pastor, I like to invite people to see that aren't, either don't go to the church or don't consider themselves Christians, and they don't consider themselves any other spiritual path. Now, what the Christian's relationship to other spiritual paths, again, or is another thing to talk about for another day. So in my own life, I don't try to convince, if I meet a Hindu or a Buddhist, that their way is wrong. But there's plenty of people, especially in our country, that have no way of being in that regard. And with the dissolution of considering perfect Western capitalism, American exceptionalism, you name it, as those become, I'll say, weaker or more apparently flawed, they're left with this confusion. What do I do with my life? What is the good? What is my vocation? So as followers of Christ, we have that, but that doesn't mean it's easy. But we're called to flourish where we're planted. So we'll look at that. So I preached a mini sermon there, and I will not be repetitive. There's other things. As you probably guess, I usually don't run out of things to say. So there's our look ahead. That's coming up on August 30th. Today, by the way, is Wednesday, August 26th. So our racial equity term of the day is structural racism. So, when I talk to people about racism, specifically white people, they very often say, I'm not a racist. I don't think there's anything wrong with black people or people of color. I don't do anything that's racist. And, they're, in that part of the discussion, they're talking about overtly racist acts, like saying something disparaging, believing someone shouldn't receive a benefit or get a position because they're black. And I'm hoping that most of the people that watch this, most people in general, wouldn't behave that way. But that's not the only form of racism. That as white people that have been privileged by a system, we can contribute if we're not cognizant of it or aware of it, identify it, which is the point of these. Part of the every weekly meditation is these terms to make us aware. So we can be racist in as much as we contribute to systemic or structural racism. I'm sure you've heard that term before. I've said it before. So here's a good definition of structural racism. the normalization and legitimization of an array of dynamics: historical, cultural, institutional, interpersonal. I'm counting on my fingers, but they're not in frame, so it doesn't really matter. So those four things: array of dynamics, historical, cultural, institutional, interpersonal, that routinely advantage whites while producing cumulative and chronic adverse outcomes for people of color. Excuse me. Structural racism encompasses the entire system of white domination, diffused and infused in all aspects of society, including its history, culture, politics, economics, and entire social fabric. Structural racism is more difficult to locate in a particular institution, such as a church, because it involves the reinforcing effects of multiple institutions and cultural norms. Past and present, continually reproducing old and producing new forms of racism, structural racism is the most profound and pervasive form of racism. All other forms of racism emerge from structural racism. For example, we can see structural racism in the many institutional culture and structural factors that contribute to lower life expectancy for African American and Native American men compared to white men. These include higher exposure to environmental toxins, dangerous jobs, unhealthy housing, higher exposure to more lethal consequences for reacting to violence, stress, and racism, lower rates of health care coverage, access and quality of care, and systematic refusal by the nation to fix things. So I'll give you an example from my life. I apologize if I've already used this one. An example of witnessing structural racism. Going to college in Fort Worth, Texas, I remember on more than one occasion that someone got out of hand. They had a few too many drinks. One of my friends named Dale got pulled over, drinking and driving. He was driven back to the dorm and not arrested. A few other times, altercations, physical altercations, fights, even and including mouthing off to the police. These were white people, my white male friends. They were taken back. They were separated and then driven back to their dorms, no charges. And I don't think you have to be told that had they been a person of color, young men of color, that would not have been the case. So there's an example in my own life, structural racism. Finally, my challenge to you. So I've been talking a lot about just in secular terms, challenging you to do things in secular terms. I haven't really been talking a lot about things we can do in the religious world, in the Christian world, about a challenge to grow in racial sensitivity. So this time, this week, I want you to you can do some internet research, find in your Bible what you suppose that Jesus Christ would say, what would be his response to the racial strife in our country. If asked, we can imagine Jesus with shades on, walking out of the temple or wherever he was preaching in 2020. A microphone is put up to his face, and he's asked, "What is your take on the racial strife in our country?" What do you suppose he would say? You don't have to write it out. You can if you want. It may help you articulate it. But I want you to grapple with it and imagine what would be his take. What would he say? What would he think we needed to do? This is a more complicated way of saying what would Jesus do in this case. But to have a thought experiment about what would he say? What would he say to this? Should be fun to explore that. So come to church, please, on August 30th at 10:30. If you are not feeling safe, considering the coronavirus, please watch us. It will be, I usually get it edited and up sometime before 3 p.m. on Facebook and YouTube. Finally, some people have asked me about these terms that I find. So the first comment on YouTube and Facebook will have the website in which I find the vocabulary of racial equity, these concepts that we can learn in order to grow spiritually in the face of the suffering in this country. That is all from me, my very good friends. Hope to see you Sunday.